Hey everybody, Mo here, and in this episode of Think Like a Pro, I'm going to talk with you guys about control decks and the control archetype, and how to play the control deck at the highest level. Now, control in any game I've played has been looked at as the hardest archetype to pilot correctly, and because of that, most players tend to lean more towards the aggressive decks, and then towards the tempo deck. So it's kind of like, you'll see the general learning curve of somebody when they first get into card games in general, or if they first get into a specific card game. They usually lean more towards the easy to pilot aggro decks that are most of the time fairly simple. You place all your creatures on the board, and then you just swing at their face. And then once they get a little bit better at the game, a little bit more knowledge, sometimes aggro can peak at a certain point. And so let's say, aggro can get you through, an arena, Magic Arena is pretty easy to get to Diamond with aggressive decks. It could be a bad aggressive deck. I played a free-to-play budget aggro deck all the way up to Diamond on a Smurf account once in a video. So you do that, but you can't really get past Diamond. So then that's when they start to lean more towards the mid-range type decks and the tempo decks. And those are the decks that still play creatures and still hit face a lot, but have better matchups against aggro and better, a better time against control sometimes. And then the hardest decks to play to a lot of people are the control decks. And because of this, a lot of people tend to not play it. Now, control takes a lot of patience, a lot of knowledge of the game, and the current state of the meta, as well as stamina. Because as long as you're playing a control deck, you're going to want to make the game last as long as possible. And if you don't think stamina is a real thing that you need, trust me, I've taken a control deck to a Grand Prix, sit there and played control for over 8 hours straight, 9 rounds, and I was dead by the end of the day. I was exhausted. It was awful. And then I had to turn around the next day and play another 5 or 6 rounds with it. And it can take a toll on you. The first couple rounds, it doesn't feel that bad, but if you plan on sitting there and grinding with this deck, if it's the deck you want to spend all your shards on, and you plan on playing Legends of Runeterra, a decent amount of time, just prepare your mental. It gets exhausting after a while. So, let's jump into our first topic, which is how control decks want to make the games last as long as possible. Making the game last as long as possible is what most control decks try to do. This is because most of the ways control decks win and finish the game is usually through either really expensive cards or really late game styles worth of cards. Like War Mother's Call, She Who Wonders are very expensive, big end game cards that can help you finish a game rather quickly. Or leveled up champion abilities like Karma and Ezreal don't really use the expensive side of the argument. However, it takes, quite a while to get them set up. Ezreal, you have to have cast at least 8 targeting spells. Karma, you have to be, at least at 10 mana. So those don't necessarily cost a whole bunch, but they still take time to rack up. So control decks usually find ways to make the game last longer by reacting to what cards your opponents play. And since control decks are reactive by nature, the most important and difficult thing to get right is knowing when and what to react to make sure you can make it to the end game and win. The biggest mistake players make, or players new to control make, is when they decide to react to everything. People think like, oh, I'm a control deck, I have this kill spell or I have this counter spell. The very first spell you cast, I'm going to counter it. Or the very first creature you play, I'm going to decide to kill it. Just because you have a kill spell or you have a deny in your hand doesn't mean that you have to use it on the first unit or spell your opponent plays. Like, every time you decide to react to a card, there should be a purpose with the goal of reaching the end game in mind. Think about most sports and most esports. Most games or, esports have plays or strategies. Each play has a reason they're in the playbook, or each strategy has a reason, you pull it out and start using it. In professional CSGO, players don't just randomly decide what bomb to go to. They don't decide what random path they want to take to get there just because it sounds fun. Each person is going a specific path to specifically go to a very specific bomb site that they've practiced before, and it's their player, their strategy, and they go there with one purpose, and that's to execute their game plan to win the game in the long run. So when you're trying to decide whether or not a card is worth your removal spell or counterspell, you could ask yourself, how fast can this card kill me? And how important is this card to my opponent's game plan? Now, this is just one example of why you'll need to know the meta and have a general knowledge of all of the meta decks, or at least most of the decks. If you have no clue what deck your opponent is playing, or you have no idea what his game plan is or how they win, you'll find yourself in some very tough places when trying to decide whether or not to kill a specific unit. So, not only in control decks do you have to know your deck, you also have to know every other deck. In aggro, it's fairly simple. You can just know how your deck wins, you can know how your deck decides to kill, and then that's pretty simple. You don't really care what your opponent's doing because you just plan to kill them in 3 to 4 turns. With control, it's very different. You have to not only know the ins and outs of your deck and how to play it flawlessly, but you also have to know the ins and outs of every other deck and know what's important in every other deck for you to know, okay, do I need to kill this? Do I need to counter this? Or not? So let's look at our first example. Let's say your opponent is playing a Zed Katarina deck. Oh, by the way, for whatever reason, unknown to a person with above 0 IQ, Riot decided to go ahead and not only tell you what region combination or colors your opponent is playing, but literally exactly what champions they're playing, which most of the time, that'll tell you exactly what deck they're playing before you even mulligan. So use this to your advantage when you go to mulligan and try and already formulate your game plan, kind of before the game really starts. At least until someone comes to their senses and removes the fact of just telling you exactly what deck your opponent is playing from the get-go. Okay, sorry. So back to the example. Let's say your opponent is playing a Zed Katarina deck, and you're playing the Ezreal Heimerdinger control deck. It's turn 2, and your opponent plays a Navori Conspirator. In your hand, you have a Mystic Shot. Do you play your Mystic Shot to kill the Navori Conspirator? No. Let's start by asking ourselves the 2 questions previously stated. How fast can this card kill me? So, the Navori Conspirator has 3 power, but no extra abilities or ways to increase the amount of damage it can do. So the card can kill you by itself in 7 turns. That's a very long time. That's no pressure at all, basically. Now let's ask ourselves the second question. How important is this card to my opponent's game plan? Let's assume we have perfect knowledge of the meta and the decks, so we can safely say that Navori Conspirator is not important to your opponent really at all. It's kind of just a creature with a decent attack early game. Instead, you save your Mystic Shot for the next turn, because you know that both Zed and Katarina have 2 health, and they both can be played on turn 3. Both Zed and Katarina are much more valuable to your opponent's game plan, and much more of a threat to you, since they both have abilities that can speed up the process on how fast they kill you, with Katarina being able to make your opponent be able to attack multiple times per turn, and with Zed being able to pump out another creature that has the same stats as him. So you want to prioritize interrupting your opponent's game plan by killing the Zed, the Katarina, or, preferably both. Some of the questions that I've gotten in my comments and in my DMs have been about what are good cards for the specific deck. So I decided to go ahead in this episode and have a topic on deck construction. Now, when you're looking to make a control deck, there's a couple of questions you can ask yourself about the card to see if it should go into your deck or not. First question is, does this card help the game go into the later stages? And the second question is, does this card end the game, and at what point does it end the game, and how fast does it end the game? So, cards that help the game last longer, these are going to be your kill spells, your recall abilities, and the creatures that can block early game fairly well, or have some type of ability to gain you health or save you health early game. All of these types of cards are amazing for control decks and are great at prolonging a game. By killing your opponent's main threats with kill spells, you save a bunch of health and relieve pressure on the board. Recall abilities don't permanently get rid of your opponent's threats, but they can buy you the extra turn or two to make it to the end game where you can finally put down your Haymaker. And the creatures that block early will save you a lot of health against certain aggressive creature decks. Especially, if you play the creature that gains you 1 crystal every turn, he also has, a fairly big defense, so you can even use him to block one. So not only is that card gaining you mana every turn, but now it's also saving you health every time it blocks. Or it's probably only going to block about 1 time, but it'll at least save you 2 to 3 health. The second part is cards that end the game. Most control decks like to use really big and really expensive finishers that are almost impossible to deal with. You know, if you spend your entire game not really doing much or just trying to survive, I would hope, you hope at that point that the card you plan to win with basically just wins you the game on the spot or within 2 turns most of the time. Because it'd be really sad if you sat there for 10 turns, barely escaping death, and just trying to stay in the game to play a card that can get answered with by every deck. So, I mean, let's look at She Who Wanders, for example. When She Who Wanders enters the battlefield, she kills off all of the small followers, so your opponent has a hard time chump blocking with non-important creatures, both in their hand and on the field. And then, after that, you have this huge Tintin on the field that can possibly, end the game over the course of 2 turns, assuming your opponent's health is full. And it's going to be really hard for most decks to answer this card. And for some decks, it's literally impossible to answer this card. Like, they just don't have anything that can deal with 10 power, or a 10-10. Unless you have a direct kill spell, or unless you just find a way to block it and then use all of your pump spells. But, if your Zed Katarina opponent uses 3 pump spells and, whatever creature to block and kill the She Who Wanders, you still just 4-for-1 them, and now they have probably no way to effectively kill you, because they just spent all of their pump spells trying to not die. And the last thing I'm going to cover here is another question I've gotten quite a lot in my comments and messages to me have been, do I recommend this deck for a new player, or do I recommend this deck for whenever the game first launches? Honestly, no. Not really. So control decks usually pop off and get really, really good late into the meta, or mid to late in the meta, once all of the tier 1 or S tier decks have been discovered. So when your aggro deck has been basically polished and is perfected, and your mid-range deck has been polished and perfected, and then people start to look at these decks and then find answers to them. Maybe, there's an answer to Zed that's super good that completely shuts down Zed, or completely shuts down Katarina, or Draven, or Jinx, or something like that. And, you have to see what cards are good enough to be played in the other decks, in the aggressive decks, so that way you can find an answer to it. Because maybe there's a perfect answer to Hecarim, right? That costs 1 mana. 1 mana, your opponent can't play Hecarims. Well, that's really good, but it's completely useless if nobody's playing Hecarim. But if there's a card like that based around Zed or something, let's imagine there's a 2 mana, your opponent can't get shadow creatures, or there's a 2 mana, your opponent can't attack more than once per turn, or something like that, then those cards are really good against the Katarina decks, and then so you'll want to be able to find a way to build that into your control deck. So I don't really recommend playing control if you're newer to the game, if you don't really know the format, and if the meta first comes out. Now, I said a lot that the Anivia Tryndamere control deck would be the deck I'm probably going to play on opening day. And I've actually been thinking about it, and I don't think that's going to be true. I think I'm going to play whatever the most aggressive deck I can find is, assuming nothing gets hard nerfed. Because in Magic, the way I did it, and with every other things, so the first day or first week of an expansion or of a banned and restricted announcement, the meta's crazy. No one knows exactly what they want. People just know, oh, this card looks cool. Oh, this Tryndamere, this She Who Wanders, this War Mother's Call looks really nice, and they look cool. They're 13 mana, so it's okay, I'm going to put this mediocre deck together that's going to make me try and survive until turn 13 or turn whatever. Meanwhile, you have people that play aggro decks that go, okay, well, you sit there and you try and live to turn 13, or you try to do this with your deck, or you try and get this perfect 4-card combo off, or 3-card combo. My deck's fairly straightforward. My deck's really simple. There's been 1,000 versions of every aggro deck ever. It's very simple. You don't even have to have the perfect aggro deck to start. You literally just need anything that does damage early game. And most of the time, you can end up killing and destroying any deck that's trying to do this late game cutesy stuff, or cast, 13 mana stuff. So I am more than likely going to try and play some aggro deck. I would recommend, if you want to be a tryhard and try and grind ranked ladder for the first, probably week even, for free, I'm gonna guess that there's gonna be an aggro deck out there that just stomps ladder for the first couple days at least, until people start to figure out the perfect combinations to the mid-range, Garen Fiora decks or something like that. Maybe Fiora deck's the answer. I don't know. We'll see. I think I'm gonna put a video out on exactly what deck I plan on playing after the patch notes come out on Wednesday. I'm going to read the patch notes, and then I'm probably going to put a video out with a deck that has exactly what 40 cards I'm going to be playing on opening day, and probably for a while. So be on the lookout for that video if you want to play the same deck I'm playing on opening day. And that's going to be it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys learned something about Control that you didn't know before. I hope you guys come around for the next video where it's going to be about Tempo decks, the third and last archetype for Legends of Runeterra. And I put videos out every Wednesday, Saturday. I stream on Twitch Monday through Friday. Follow me on there, subscribe here so you guys don't miss anything, and I'll see you in my next video.